Mr. Chairman, members of the board, there are several things I asked for in the budget, Mr. Taylor, that are priorities. So I don't want to stand here and list all the priorities and go through the budget. But I did want to clarify a couple things, if it's okay with the board. I'll try not to be too long-winded. But the issue of SROs didn't only surface after the events in Florida. The board members that have been here for a while now, if you will allow me, I'll take you back through a couple years and tell you what we've asked for in the past as far as SROs. But as a sheriff, I need to address the board and some recent comments and some misinformation concerning the fiscal year 2019 budget. It's the desire of the sheriff's office to always be transparent during the budget process. We have no problem with constructive criticism and providing answers to clarify issues. The sheriff's office makes presentation to the board as frequently as any other agency in the county. Leading up to these presentations, we consistently meet with the school board, county staff, various other agencies, and community leaders, and we also provide an annual report of the Sheriff's Department on our website for the citizens to review. Due to evolving changes in our community and ongoing violence in our nation's schools, we have always asked for additional school resource officers. The request for consideration is in no way a new one, but reflects the outcries of our citizens and is meant to more effectively deal with escalating violence in our schools. It is not our desire to throw a kink in the budget, but to enter into meaningful dialogue with the board as you do final deliberations on the 2019 budget. Since the 2019 budget process began last fall, the nation is faced with more violence. We would be remiss if we did not reflect on recent events and make budget decisions that carefully look at the ways to prevent similar events happening in our community. We have met with and spoken with hundreds as we taught ALERT, which is active shooter training. We've taught it to the employees at the mall, to the county employees, to school employees, churches, businesses, parents, and deputies. The consensus is they want trained, able individuals to effectively deal with potential violent threats. School resource officers are not present to just meet and greet individuals as they enter a school. An effective SRO is consistently interacting with students, teachers, and visitors as they build a trusting relationship. High school SROs are assigned to primary high schools along with a secondary elementary school. That clears up some of the comments about going to school not seeing an SRO. They don't stand at the front door all day and greet people. They have other duties. Middle school SROs are also assigned to a middle school, and they are also assigned to secondary elementary schools. Our grant-funded SRO is only assigned to one school. That's by the provisions of the grant. Currently, the SRO will meet with school administration to discuss any potential issues that may be taking place within the school. They aid school staff in matters that require legal intervention and/or advice in related law matters. SRO conducts security checks of the school throughout the day and report to staff any deficiencies. They handle legal advice for matters from school staff, county administration, students, and parents. Every SRO participates in safety audits for the school's lockdown procedures, which occur 4 times a year. SROs participate in threat assessments, serve as mentors for students, and provide a visible law enforcement presence. SROs are not the only tool the Sheriff's Office uses to protect our children, but they play a vital role in keeping our schools safe. In respect, I will address a couple of recent comments. A comment was made that the sheriff wants to CYA. Yes, the sheriff does want to CYA. CYA means covering young adolescents, and I will continue to do so. In regard to the question of how many SROs have we added since the tragedy at Sandy Hook, you may recall the 2014 recommended budget presentation to the board, and this is an excerpt from the board, or from me to the board. The tragic events that occurred at Sandy Hook Elementary in Newtown, Connecticut have generated much conversation both within our community and a state level about the proper measures necessary to secure our schools. Some have suggested that all schools have at least one school resource officer on site. We currently have a dedicated SRO at each of our high schools and middle schools, and for now this budget includes no additional resources that would allow us to place dedicated SROs at our elementary schools. And once again, I remind you, this is from 2014. However, shortly after the Sandy Hook incident, staff from the Sheriff's Office, the schools, and county administration formed a task force to quickly identify and address security concerns. The task force continues to meet, and many areas of concern have been addressed. There are several proposals circulating in the General Assembly about school safety. And my hope at that time was that these safety concerns passed, that there would be funding for them. The budget process has always been a fluid process due to state and federal mandates, significant events, and available resources. It was mentioned this week by bringing this forward now equates to not being a priority in the early budget process. So I just took you back to 2014. That's 4 years ago, 5 years ago, with the budget we're looking at. I would like to remind the board of our history of earlier requests for SROs over the last 6 years. The history has included 3 grant-funded SROs, 2 county-funded DARE officers, and 5 denied SRO grants that we requested that we did not get. From the budget review meeting 2017, nearly $125,000 was included for 2 additional DARE officers in the schools, in the Sheriff's Office. I recommended DARE officers because at that point in time we did not have the funds to complete our SRO program. So as long as we could get a couple more DARE officers, we were at least able to have these officers floating from school to school while they taught the DARE program. We are now in the 2019 budget process, and many things have changed since the presentation of the county administrator's recommended budget, which Mr. Taylor just advised. However, there has been one consistent theme in all the budgets since I've been sheriff. Safety of our citizens and children is of utmost concern for the Sheriff's Department and for the board. But competing needs and lack of funding result in choices that are difficult to make. In closing, I will continue to work with the board towards developing a budget so that it is in the best interest of our citizens. I embrace constructive dialogue with the board, but I remain committed to the safety of all our citizens and children using all available resources that I can get. My desire is that we move past the accusations and misinformation and can continue to work towards solutions that improve our community. I thank you for your past support, and I look forward to working with the board in the future. And I'm going to conclude by saying that in my 49-year career, I never thought that we'd be in a society where our families are murdered in places of worship and our children are murdered in schools. So as the sheriff, I feel responsible for this community. I'm happy to work with you any way I can. And I hope I've cleared up some miscommunications, some on my part, some not on my part. Thank you.
Any questions from the board? Dr. Chairman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think one point that needs to be clarified from last Thursday's budget hearing, when Mr. Taylor presented his budget, it was at the equalization rate, but he also presented a scenario whereby each department's request could be met at the 85-cent tax rate, which is what this board advertised. And last Thursday, numerous speakers, possibly a majority of speakers, got up and asked us to fund every request, which they said could be done at the 85-cent tax rate. I think it's fair to note that that is no longer true. because the request for SROs did not exist at the time that we advertised the tax rate. So with that added in, the advertised tax rate cannot cover every request. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no room for SROs. As has been mentioned a couple times, there were a lot of requests that Mr. Taylor's budget did not fund, so there is room there, and both Mr. Yakubowski and Mr. McLaughlin have come forward with budget scenarios which fund at least half of the requested SROs, and I appreciate their efforts in that regard. As I'm sure you know, the CYA comment was mine. That was perhaps rash. The question about how many SROs we had added since Newtown was also mine. And I didn't really think the finance staff would know. I wouldn't expect them to know that off the top of their head. But the point was, as you know, I'm on the finance committee, and every time your office seeks a grant for SROs, it comes before us. You mentioned that there have been 8 such requests, and I've supported every one of them, both on the finance committee and here on the board. So I've always supported adding SROs, and I hope that we can do that in this budget process as well. My comment was rash, but my concern is that we've always had a strong relationship since we were both elected. And I wish the request had arrived differently. I heard about it first from Mr. Benton Monday before last, the day before it was presented to us here, 3 days before the budget hearing. I'm told that it was floating around long before that. In fact, I'm told by a school board member that I don't want to identify who it was, but he or she was approached by your office to lobby us about a proposal that I didn't even know existed. I am concerned that your office and our staff have not been working well together, and that is to the detriment of the community. So we will be in discussions and trying to fund as many SROs as we can, but I hope we can work on the process and work together better in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
So do I, Mr. Chairman. May I respond to that?
Absolutely.
At no point in time have I asked anyone to approach a board member about SROs. And as far as Thursday night meeting in Massaponax, I don't know how many people spoke. I left shortly after the greetings were done. I did not ask anyone to come to that meeting and support SROs, and I have not asked anyone to lobby the school, this Board of Supervisors.
No, I didn't think that you had asked them to as far as last Thursday, but a lot of the public was under a misimpression. I wanted to clear that up.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Skinner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sheriff, would you tell us, okay, so we understand the RSOs come under your control and should be. They're part of your department. But how does the school react? Does the school come to you after these events and everything and have asked you for extra school resource officers? Because that's for me, I think it is the responsibility of everybody, us, you, and the school.
So do I, Mr. Skinner. And since Dr. Baker has been here as the school superintendent, we've had a task force. We meet usually monthly, sometimes even more often, depending on what's going on, with the SROs, with some members of my command staff, and with Dr. Baker's school security staff. And this engrosses a lot, not just the talk about SROs. We've talked about armed security guards, we've talked about armed militia, we've talked about metal detectors, we've talked about everything under the sun. So we do this in trying to keep the schools and the sheriff's department on the same track so that we know what the schools are doing. I think the board here has been involved in a lot as far as allocating funds to make some of these schools safer as far as one entrance that can be seen from a point inside the office with automatic door locks and things like that. And all that, Mr. Skinner, is a result of the task force meeting between the schools and the sheriff's office.
On that note, so you guys have been discussing, which I'm glad to hear. I mean, because I think it has to start at the schools. I think the superintendent is also responsible for the safety of his school going through you.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And so my question is, when these incidents happened, have they come, has the school board or the superintendent come to you and asked you for a specific amount of school resource officers? And I will say one other thing. I appreciate the fact that you're talking about the other things, because I think this board, there are members of this board that didn't know exactly what you guys discussed. And I think when you don't know what's going on, as far as, you're right, what about the metal detectors and automatic door locks and stuff of this nature? We have no idea. And to be honest with you, I would like to see, as far, and it's not necessarily you or the superintendent, but some update to actually know what's going on, because I've been very concerned about, as far as top priority is keeping our kids safe. And that's going to mean, if it means school resource officers, in a proper manner, in a timely manner, as far as what you can train and what you can't train. I know we have the same problem with the ALS.
Right.
Okay, so
a lot of the things that we discuss, we obviously wouldn't want to make public for obvious reasons, for security reasons. However, I think Dr. Baker, it's kind of hard for me to speak for him, but I feel Dr. Baker, myself, John Lynn from school security, and maybe my SRO supervisor would be happy to come to the board. And I don't know if you can do it in closed session. We could tell you everything that we're doing, but I wouldn't want to stand in a public forum and say everything that we are trying to accomplish, Mr. Skinner, to keep our kids safe.
well, and all I'm asking for is that we understand before we jump to conclusion on something.
Yes.
We should at least have some background in knowing that, you know, because we don't do it, and I don't want to do it. But certainly, if I'm going to fund it and try to find some money, is trying to find out, what do you really need, what are you thinking about, and stuff of this nature. It's just hard to fund a blank check. And I think we need to know. We can keep it confidential, because I agree with you. We don't want people knowing.
I understand that, and if you look at my past with the board, things that I really need to keep the community safe, I keep the board informed as early as I possibly can. And after Florida, this thing just kind of mushroomed, and I'll be completely honest with the board members, it was out of my control. And the people that came forward, the citizens and things like that, did so at their own behest and not at the behest of the sheriff's department, and I don't think at the behest of Dr. Baker.
I will tell you this, I've so far, as long as I've sat on this board with all the sheriffs, the different sheriffs, y'all done a great job. You've all done a great job.
I agree to that.
And it's been a pleasure to support you all during that time. And I know this is somewhat a crisis now, but when you're in a crisis, then that's even more reason to probably keep people informed, so it doesn't get out of control and rumors and stuff of that nature. But I do appreciate what you and everybody else has done for us.
Thank you.
Mr. Marshall.
Sheriff Harris, given the time constraints that we have and the monetary constraints that Mr. Trampy's mentioned, I asked Finance to provide some numbers for me on a 10-month SRO. While some of the other board members have put proposals together to try to get half of the SROs and different things, I don't want to take that chance, to be honest with you. I don't want to have the chance of, if we put one at Robert E. Lee and we don't put one at Berkeley, sure enough, what's going to happen? Somebody's coming to Berkeley. I don't want to gamble on this. If we hire 10-month employees to cover those 11 positions, we can do it at lower cost. Could you make a 10-month, it wouldn't be considered a part-time person, but could you make that work with your staff?
I don't know that, I'd have to do some checking on that, Mr. Marshall. I'm not sure because all SROs are fully sworn deputies. And I had a correspondence with Mr. Ross, wanting to know what the SROs do for that other 2 months. But I don't know, and maybe one of the other sheriffs out here would know more than I do and put them right on the spot. But I don't think there's any way through DCJS to have a 10-month employee as an SRO. During the summer months, the SROs use that time to do their DCJS training. They do their SRO recertification, and the couple of months that they have off, if they're not working summer camps or something with some of the youth camps that we support, then they're working for other divisions of Mr. Marshall and the Sheriff's Department. They're working in courts, they're working in administrative services, they're serving civil papers. Some are assigned back to the patrol to help beef up the patrol in the summer months. When the kids are out of school and the crime rate soars a little bit, it gives us more bodies on the road. And we also assign some to the detective division. So it's not like the SROs don't have a full plate. That extra 2 months that they're paid, they're out there working.
Right. Now I understand that. I'm not saying they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing.
I didn't take it that way. No, sir.
I'm trying to find a way to give full coverage to all the kids. I don't want to leave. It's not fair to leave one school out and provide for another.
I understand that, but to answer your questions about 10-month employees, I don't know if the county personnel rules would permit it. I'm not sure who's here that could answer that. But I do know that if we have DCJS certified SROs, which are real police officers, I don't think many of them are going to want to take the summer off. I think they want to work year-round.
I understand.
I will say this in order to try to make this program come to fruition. Major Wells and I have been working where we are willing to take the 4 DARE officers that we have now and make those 4 DARE officers SROs. And we've also, thanks to Major Wells being a penny pincher, we've been able to squeeze out one more SRO. So I think as the Sheriff's Office itself, Mr. Marshall, can come up with funding for 5 of these positions. And I think some of the numbers, and Major Wells can address this better than I can, some of the numbers that I think we came up with from finance are a little bit high. I'm not quite sure how. I think in one of the presentations it said the cost of an SRO was $122,000 a year. Bonnie may be able to adjust that. I'm not quite sure where that figure came from, but I think it's less than $80,000. So that's a considerable difference, but Bonnie can probably tell you more, and so can Major Wells if you want him to answer it.
I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Mr. Ross?
Sheriff Harris, thank you for your service. It has been a pleasure working with you since 2012 for me, and I appreciate everything your deputies do.
Thank you.
Day in and day out. I know you're right on the front lines, and it's greatly appreciated. I have a couple questions. Segmenting on what Kevin was saying about the 10-month SROs, I'm assuming, and my understanding is that the schools currently could contract security guards that would be armed, that they have to be retired law enforcement. And that could be for a 10-month period. What's the downside to that? Because I'm assuming there is.
The downside to that, to me, as sheriff, is number one, they're going to have to be DCJS certified to be law enforcement. And for them to be part-time employees at the school, it would be quite a large civil undertaking as sheriff to be responsible for what I see as armed civilians in a school. If it's a true SRO and it's a real law enforcement officer, that's one thing. But being the sheriff and being responsible for people that used to be in the military or used to be police officers, and God knows I love them and I support them, but I'm not sure that's the answer. I think with the duties that I see and expect from an SRO go a lot farther than having an armed person in the school.
Okay. These additional SROs, they would be for our elementary schools, correct?
That's correct, sir.
And so then there would be no more rotation. So in other words, I know one of the complaints that you've heard was, hey, we're at the school and there's no SRO, and that's because they're rotating to another school at that time. If you had the 11 additional SROs and converted the DARE officers and we had full at the elementary, would the SROs, all of ours, be then at the school from the beginning of the school till school is out, or is there policy that would have them still doing other things during the
There's
day?
not really policy,
Okay.
Mr. Ross, but there are job duties. If an SRO is forced to go to court, if an incident happens in school, if the judge wants him in court, he's going to be in court, and nobody can stop that.
Sure.
We try to always use the summer months to do their training, but there are times where they maybe miss a day or two for training, specialized training that the SRO would have to have, or a specialized class in active shooter or something that we could do only on
Sure.
a Wednesday afternoon. So to stand here and say that every second that SRO would be in that school, I cannot do that.
Sure.
But there would be very few times that that school would not be covered by an SRO.
Thank you. One of the complaints that I heard, and I don't know if it made it to you, was that SROs can leave the campus and just go to lunch. Is that,
That hasn't happened on my watch.
okay, all right.
Now, they have to eat, and they can do the same thing the sheriff does, bring a bologna sandwich.
Sure, I do the same.
Works out great.
Well, I like roast beef better.
Okay.
Okay, Bonnie, could we have the floor computer, and could we put that slide back up? Yep. So I think this is the slide that we were talking about, and you were saying it might not be as much. I was wondering about the vehicles, and I think Bonnie had the cost at $35,000 a.
$35,000 per vehicle, and the vehicle line item here, as I noted, the first time that this was briefed to the board, is 5 vehicles. Even though there are 15 positions being requested, it's 5 vehicles, and the sheriff's office has reported that they are able to, if they get the 15, able to purchase only 5 new vehicles, rotate those to patrol, rotate 5 out of patrol, and then extend the life cycle for the remaining 10, and then replace those over time. So what's shown here, and it is the same on every option, is 5 vehicles at $35,000. And while I'm here, down at the bottom of this slide, it does say SRO cost per officer, including a vehicle, is $122,503. That is $87,000 in personnel and operating costs, because it's not just personnel costs. There are first-year startup costs and then recurring operating costs. That's $87,000, and then $35,000 for a vehicle brings it to $122,000.
Okay. Do you think all the SROs, well, it seems like there's only 5, but do they need a car furnished for them?
Every SRO will need a car, yes, sir, to perform their duties. Number one, I want a marked car sitting out in front of the school, obviously. But we, when I say we, Major Wells has worked out a way we can replace 5 older cars from patrol, and with a little bale and wire and duct tape, we got something we can keep running.
Okay. I had a couple more questions. I'm not sure, and if I go out of bounds here, if these are things you'd prefer to talk to us in closed session, let me know. So I've just personally experienced a couple times, as a matter of fact, at the budget hearing, I didn't know the correct door to go in, and I went in the wrong door. A student let me in. Are you convinced that we've done all we can do as far as training? I mean, one of the things, it was a student that let me in, right? But this is after school hours. And then I've also been out at a different high school really early in the morning, and I got asked if I wanted I was checking traffic flows at this high school. And I was asked by a student if I wanted in, just to go in. It was before the SRO was even there. Are you convinced that we've done all I know there's always room to improve, but in these cases, it's almost like, hey, I'm just walking in here. And I think at the public hearing the other night, there was the teacher from D.C. who talked about dropping her child off at the back end of Massaponax High School, and that he could just walk in the back door, but she had to get checked in the front door. And I don't know if that's true. That's just what she said.
That's the twofold question.
Yeah, I've got a lot of stuff here. I guess basically, it seems like, and it's not your fault or anybody's fault, but it's just human nature. We get used to it. We're not used to being on high guard all the time.
Right.
And, you know, if a guy's in a suit or has an umbrella and it's a rainy day, it's the kind thing to say, can I get the door for you?
What we've tried to do, working with Dr. Baker and Mr. Lynn and the school staff, is to educate the kids not to open a door. But you always have that nice, polite kid that sees you coming and wants to help you in. As far as the issue at Mass, we address that all the time with Mr. Lynn and the school security staff on ways to eliminate that. Part of the problem, Massaponax High School is a major problem because of all the temporary classrooms out back. And there are, I think, about 900 kids that are always going back and forth between that building and those trailers out back. So we have talked about that and really beat a dead horse on how can we keep that part of the school safe. And the SRO there, as well as the first sergeant in charge of the SROs, are very aware of it and try to keep an eye on it as much as possible. But the only thing you could really do is put an SRO or someone at that door all day long.
Sure.
And
it'd have to be more than one door, it'd be multiple doors.
And some of the schools, Spotswood, for example, is a problem all of its own because of all the independent buildings.
Yep.
And then there are a couple of the other schools, I won't mention by name, that have the wrong configuration, Mr. Ross, coming in the front door where they cannot be seen from the office. So Dr. Baker and his staff are, I know, actively working on that. 2 weeks ago, we had a meeting about what different schools need, and we've done quite a few threat assessments through the Sheriff's Department on different schools as far as numbering doors, trying to educate the kids, don't open the door. But you always have the polite kid that you hope yours will grow up to be that does that.
Yep. Let's see. A question I asked the school security, and this was, I think, probably 4 or 5 years ago, is I remember asking how many military retired teachers do the schools have? And at that time, and I haven't brought it up since, this is like 5 years ago, the chief of school security had no idea. Do you work with, have you identified retired military that are in the schools, what our numbers are, and are they part of active shooter drills?
I cannot tell you how many retired military people have kids in schools. I do not know that.
Or that are teachers. That's what I'm really looking for.
I cannot do that. Some of the teachers have approached me and told me they're retired military and so forth. And there are a few out there that are actually retired law enforcement. Most requests I get from the community come from more the militia type military that wants to walk around the school with a rifle all day.
Sure.
So those are the things as sheriff that I don't think our kids need to see all day long, but you know, if that's what we have to do to have security, that's a whole nother ball game. But I do get a lot of requests from people in the community that are, I don't want to use the term militia, but basically that's what they are. Want to know if they can patrol the schools and things like that. Yep. And I tell them right now, I don't think that's a wise idea. And I always make Dr. Baker and his staff aware of that also.
My concern more was hoping to bring the synergist. Like, I know a couple of my friends who have retired from the Marine Corps and are now teachers. And I've not asked them if they go, but I think would be a good idea to, if they volunteer and want to be part of those lockdown drills, to use that experience. And it's not, again, I think it's more on the schools than on the Sheriff's Department. To be part of those drills and those procedures. I think it's at least good to identify those that want to self-identify, so that in those lockdown drills they can be, used in the key positions that you need them to be.
Mr. Cole might be able to address that more. I'm not quite sure if any legislation have changed this year, but at one point in time, you could not be armed in a church or in a school, so I don't know.
I'm not talking about arming them, just being aware of who they are and that they have those skills. And you can carry in a church. 99% sure from Ken Cuccinelli's ruling that that's legit.
Okay.
Maybe Mark can back me up on that or tell me I'm wrong.
The church gun ban, basically, the way it's worded, it says you cannot carry in a house of worship during a worship service. And then it says, unless you have a good reason to. And then it never defines what a good reason is.
I like those kind of
Yeah,
laws.
the Attorney General opined probably 10 years ago that the way it's written, if somebody's concerned about self-defense, that would be good and sufficient reason to carry, so
But
it's
does-
almost unenforceable.
That doesn't apply to schools, I don't think.
No, it does not
Okay.
apply to schools at all, no.
So the last question I have, and I'm sure you're doing it, but it seems like, I just read an article that London has just as high of a murder rate that New York City does, but London is a gun, or knives, and New York City is guns. And it reminds me that a lot of our violence and hate comes from the human heart. So what ways are you addressing, and it seems like, we see the bullies. I think I don't know if the kid in Florida was bullied, and there are no excuses for that kind of behavior. It's just pure evil. But how are we addressing that human heart issue? Because one of the biggest threats is probably our own students, and another would be an outsider.
Well, I think our own students are probably the biggest threat. And the bullying is every time we have a meeting with Dr. Baker and his staff talking about school security in any shape or form, the issue of bullying always comes up. And in trying to identify the bullies, trying to have the teachers and the guidance counselors work with them and try to educate them. But bullying has been around forever. I'm afraid it always will be. I don't know what the answer to that is. I think it's something that has to come from the school staff more than the sheriff's department. But I will say this, that's one advantage to having a sheriff's deputy in the school in uniform, because a lot of times they are able to identify, working with the staff, school bullies. They've been able to talk to them. A perfect example is what happened at Riverbend High School a few years ago. Had it not have been for that SRO having a rapport with one student in that school, would be having a totally different conversation tonight.
Right.
So I don't know the answer, Mr. Ross, I'll be honest with you.
Mr. Yakubowski.
Thank you. First of all, Sheriff, thank you for coming this evening.
Thank you, sir.
Appreciate your presentation and your candor. And one thing that did hit me that you had said, and it is unfortunate, is that we do live in a society where these things are happening. And as Mr. Ross said, it is pure evil. And if evil didn't exist, and if our sin nature was not there, you would not have a job. But unfortunately, that's not part of this earth.
I'd be glad to retire if it all stopped.
I'm absolutely. And so my concern is not when the request came forward or if it's after a certain period. I think that we need to respond to the needs that our community faces. And so I do applaud you for coming up with a very ingenious idea, in my opinion, to convert the DARE officers to SROs in conjunction with what they do with the DARE program. So there are ways that we can get, excuse me, to that point of having sworn deputies in our school system doing multiple functions. One of the benefits that I've heard from a lot of people is that the SROs being in the schools show a good example to those in our community who perhaps have come through generations of, let's just say, not respecting the police, whether it's through their relatives, whether it's through the music and movies that are out there. There's a lot of that really puts a divide up. And so by having the SROs in there, they become more personable, they become more accessible, and I think that also helps and could possibly even help in some kids' lives to show them that the sheriff's department and the police officers are not the enemy. They're there on your side. And so I think that is another benefit that we need to highlight also. It's not just the protection of our school system and our kids while they're at school, but it's also having that positive influence that can really change some lives. So one of my proposals in here, and in talking with your department too, was to try to get to full coverage in 2 years, because I know it takes a while to train, because I know SROs come from current staffing and are plugged into the system, and then they're backfilled in with new recruits. And so this is not something that we can flip a switch and everything's covered, and there's not a school that you can go and pull them out of and put them in and say everything's covered today. So I know it is a process, but what I would like to see, and what I'm trying to do, is to show a way that we can actually get this done within budget constraints that we have, because we do have budget constraints. We have them every single year, and we will continue to have them. But showing that it is a priority and is something that we can work towards. And I think that the only way that you can actually get to a goal is by setting that goal and then working towards it. And we've talked about it for years, and I'm casting no blame or assertion anywhere whatsoever. But as for myself, it's become a higher priority, and I would like to work with you and the rest of the board and the school system in getting this implemented quicker, rather than dragging feet and looking back and wishing that we would have done it. So I do appreciate your time. There's absolutely no questions in there. If you want to answer any of those, that's quite all right. But I really felt the need to say this, because I think that perhaps this conversation's taken a turn that it shouldn't take, and it needs to get back on track, because our budget should be about the priorities that our community have, and then it's up to us to find a way to fund those priorities. So I appreciate you coming and explaining in as much candor as you did.
Okay, thank you.
Thank
I
you.
would like to make 2 comments. Being a taxpayer, I appreciate you taking care of the money. But being the sheriff, I have higher interest. But on your statement, Mr. Yakubowski, about hiring and training officers, from the time we recruit and get deputies, qualified deputies, trained through the regional academy, through 400 hours of field training, and then get them through the SRO school, there's no way we could hire 15 people right now and have them trained by school year. It's absolutely impossible. So to get the highest qualified candidates that we could possibly do with the background investigations and everything that we do, if we could do part now and part next year or something like that, that might be a fix. So thank you.
Sheriff, I'll just make some comment. I never prepare anything, so you'll see how I talk here in a second. But I do have some thoughts on it. Number one, as far as priorities, if you're going to make it a priority, it should be every year. I can't go back 6, 7 years and regurgitate what you've put in a priority back then. And I would just assume that if it was a priority of yours every year, it would be right there at the forefront in our budget, where we can see, and then we make this board can make the decisions on whether to fund it or not. Then it's kind of on us. You've put it on us. Also, be quite honest, personally, I've gotten very little response as far as SROs. Most of it has been still the teachers and the pay for the teachers. Like right here, if you turned around right now and look at the audience, there's probably 90% of them are for the health care that we're going to be talking about here shortly for the retirees. We have not had an opportunity to have open forum and discussion as far as this board, and I'm still not convinced that an SRO in every single elementary school is what it's going to take to secure them. I don't think an SRO can actually secure any school to 100%. It's just impossible. It's only one person, and these schools are huge. They can certainly make a difference, but to what level, I don't know. I've never heard any quantitative, I've never seen any quantitative information as far as the benefits and stuff like for an SRO. Some of the shooting, like this last one in Florida, it had an SRO. Of course, I don't think he followed any protocol that normally goes on these days for any department, but that's what it's just what happened. But anyway, there's just so much that impacts or the cause and for these shootings. We talked about the mental health. Most of them have come from within the school, so it's their own students doing the shootings. And I will ask one question directly. Do you have an MOU with Dr. Baker about any kind of their interaction with the discipline within the school?
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's just one of my concerns. I think at one time the sheriff's office probably too aggressively pursue criminal charges on kids. And this is just my initial thoughts on that. I mean, kind of top of my head stuff. But, at some point, when a child's been in trouble and has had issues and is pointed out repeatedly, like in a number of these schools, shootings that have occurred, at some point, the criminal charge can do wonders. And that judge that oversees in those cases have a very broad scope of things they can do. Demand services, mental health issues and stuff like that be addressed. My own son at one of the schools here has been assaulted. Took 2 shots to the jaw and didn't swing at all. And I doubt the SRO even knows about it. But I learned that the kid has been suspended several times and has been has had numerous issues. At some point, when there is going to be a time for criminal charges, where to go ahead and put that child in, and if the parents aren't given the services, the school's not altering the behaviors, then maybe it is time for some criminal charges, and let's quit turning our backs on what's going on with assault's assault. At some point, there has to be some actions on our SROs criminally. We can't keep on having the same assaults occurring, the same bullying, the same stuff going on with nothing, where they get a week off of vacation, basically. I imagine a lot of these students look at it as, it's 5 days off from school, and hey, I get to go home, and mom and dad are probably working. I get to run the roost and do what I want. Then I got to go back to, these are just kind of thoughts off in my head. So there's a lot of things involved, and we've had no real open discussion about the armed security. There's been no real open discussion that I've heard or been a part of, and I think that is something to look at. Also, would we be able to look at part-time folks in the schools? We have part-time criminal investigation folks. We have part-time patrol, part-time courts. Is that something we could look at? But we're kind of getting blasted, 3/4 of the way or better into it's probably even more so, a little beyond 3/4 of the way into our budget with needing 15 personnel. And it's just, I hope you understand it on our end, where it's just, we hadn't planned on this. All of us, I found out from finance when I called to try to work some numbers on some budget stuff of my own. And they hit me with, well, we've just been asked for 15 personnel from the sheriff's office. I'm like, I don't know where we're going to get that from. So those are just some of the things. And I just, maybe I'm just too new and just haven't been part of a lot of the conversation that's apparently been going on for a while with some of the safety stuff with the schools. And there's just a whole lot more to it than just an SRO. And there's been no discussion on that. And that's what kind of got me riled up. And the way it went about, I'd rather, like I say, I'll go back to what my first thing, I'd rather you put it as a priority every single time. Then it's on this board in the county as far as denying you your priority for the schools. And, and I think we have not heard really from the schools. I think there's one board member in a joint meeting that we had said, yeah, we might need another couple of SROs. But that was from them. That was even before I even heard about your request. And, there's been no school representation or conversations I've had with any school administration that has leveraged that or has made any statements about it. I just haven't had the people reaching out to me or making that, putting it to the level that apparently you've been communicating with our citizens with. So you want to respond to any of that, go right ahead. Sorry, put it all on you at once.
I'd like to respond to a lot of it.
Okay, go ahead.
First of all, I haven't gone out and asked any citizen for anything. So if citizens come up to me and ask me, Mr. Chairman, about school security and SROs, yes, I'm in favor of it. But
Well, that's what I meant. They're coming to you
well,
requesting
neither
the
me
stuff.
or my staff have gone out and knocked on doors and said, tell the board we need SROs. That's never happened. Secondly, we do have MOUs with Dr. Baker. We also, you mentioned violence in the schools. That's another reason to have an SRO. SROs make arrests in these schools every day, and they take them to court. And earlier in my presentation, I mentioned if you go to the school and the SRO is not there, he might be in court, and that's because he's made an arrest, and you're very familiar with that process. But one thing in working with Dr. Baker and his staff, if it's a criminal violation, we take care of it. If it is administratively best that the school handle it, the school makes that decision. As far as bullying and things like that, if your son was punched twice in school and the SRO doesn't know about it, I guarantee if he knew about it, you'd be going to court with your son because we'd be placing charges. That's why we're there. And when you talk about violence in schools, that concept has changed a little bit since you were captain in charge of SROs for many years. Now the big thing is a prison to pipeline. It's better to work with these kids and try to turn them around and try to save them and to mentor these kids and try to teach them right from wrong. It's unfortunate that falls back on the sheriff's department. It should fall back on the parents, and it should fall back on the family members of these kids to do the right thing by their children. Unfortunately, we live in a society where every family member has to work to make ends meet, and there's a lot of latch-door keys kids out there that don't have a mom and dad at home and things like that. Well, some of those kids turn out to be bullies and stuff, and they become our problem, meaning the sheriff's department. They also become the community's problem as well as the school's problem. But any act of violence in a school that comes to the SRO's attention, charges are made, we go to court. What the judge does with it from there, Mr. Chairman, is up to him, and you're very familiar with that process. But as far as assaults and things like that happen in schools every day, kids get charged, petitions are sought for those kids. If they get suspended or something, that's up to the school. We take them to court. If the judge levies action against the child as part of court action, then we follow up with that, be it community service or whatever it might be. But we follow the law. And the prison to pipeline that Virginia Organizing is really sponsoring heavy and talking to all the schools about. Dr. Baker and his staff and I have met with Virginia Organizing individuals out of Richmond on 3 or 4 different occasions. And about a year ago, we actually came up with an MOU between the Virginia Organizing and the Pipeline to Prison, Dr. Baker's staff, and the Sheriff's Office as to what role the schools play in the program, what role the Sheriff's Department play. And after spending several hours going over that MOU, I'll be perfectly blunt, I made it clear to the Virginia Organizing that criminal violations in the school are going to result in charges, and they're going to go to court. Now, what Dr. Baker and his staff do with the ones that never come to our attention, Mr. Chairman, or the ones that they feel a week out of school or something, we have no part in that.
Okay. Well, that's still, then there's something can be missed. You know, that's the problem. You know, when you have charges or events taking place in a school and your SRO is kept out of the loop, I'll just say it like that. I don't know how else to say it. Then there's an issue. And, you know, the pipeline thing, I mean, if you go to any of these schools where the shootings have occurred, I'm sure they have very similar systems. You know, you ask them, how's it working for you now? I mean, it hadn't been. Something failed down the line. And if we keep on going, we're gonna, sooner or later, we're gonna fail because one of these kids aren't gonna have that SRO taking them to court and having maybe a judge give them his own services that he feels deems appropriate for that child. So that's right there that's a gap that we're missing, and I can certainly understand the schools, and I'm not meaning any disrespect for you because I'm sure you're doing a great job, but that is a gap. And
I agree with
somebody's
that.
making that decision to weigh, well, it's going to be the school's responsibility, or I think it's best that he gets 7 days, 5 days, whatever, 3 days. That's somebody's decision they're making when there was actually something criminal that occurred. And weighing, well, this student might get better. He's only had 3 other suspensions. Maybe we can get him on the right track. I mean, I'm going way out left field, but I hope you understand where I'm going.
I do. I deal with it every day. I know exactly what you're saying. I would just like to say this, that there is no way in the society, and I'm not talking about schools now, if you look at things that happen worldwide, if you look at the airport security that we have, where you back up 2 hours trying to catch a flight, and still you get on a plane with some nut with a bomb in his shoe or a bomb in his underwear. So we're not going to be able to prevent everything. And schools, Mr. Chairman, are no different. I think we do the best we can with what we have to work with. And, my biggest fear as sheriff is that we'll have an active shooter, be it a school or be it a mall or be it at a concert here on the 4th of July. That's when you're in charge of security and safety, that's something you always think about. And I'm sure a gentleman sitting right here can tell you the same thing, that, in the 30-plus years that they were sheriff in this county, we had the sniper, and we had the Les Silva, and we had things that Sheriff Waddy and Sheriff Smith dealt with that to this day still haunt them. And I'm no different. You want to do the best you can and try to cover all the bases you can. I don't know all the answers. Heck, I don't even know most of the questions, but I'm not afraid to stand up here and voice and ask. We have asked for additional SROs and past budgets, and dealing with finance sometimes that the budget gets so ballooned out, things got struck before I think sometimes it got to either Mr. Barnes or to Mr. Taylor. So, finance does a great job. And I want to apologize to Bonnie for throwing her under the bus on the $122,000. But if it weren't for the people in finance that we work with every day, and I know there are times that Bonnie Jewell says, oh, God, I got to go see Carter Wells. But it's because of the fact that we're able to work with finance the way we do. And it is a daily thing between finance and the sheriff's department, and I guess it is with other departmental directors, I don't know. But the finance ladies that we deal with go above and beyond trying to work with us and trying to help us before they bring things to the board. So, Bonnie, I'm sorry I threw you under the bus. Mary, what can I say? But they are a pleasure to work with. They try to take care of the county. They try to do the right thing for every county department and every director. And I'm honored to work with those ladies. And no, we don't always see eye to eye. And yes, usually they win. But other than that. Okay.
Sheriff, I appreciate you coming. And I just wish we'd gotten this to us a little differently and had some time to have some open conversation with the public, but
if I would have known quicker, Mr. Chairman, you would have known quicker. I assure you that. But I just the last thing I'll say, unless there are more questions, I have never solicited anybody from the public to support SROs in any way, shape, or form. So it's important to me that the board knows that and the taxpayers know that. When people stop me as the sheriff of this county and ask me point blank, what do you think of SROs? I say, I think we need them in every school. But I've never said, call your representative, come to the board meeting, come to the budget work sessions, and I would never do that because that's just not the thing to do. If the people bring it to you, Mr. Benton, that's part of the job, I guess. But I do thank the board for everything you do for us in public safety.
All right, well, we're still struggling through the budget, and hopefully we'll reach some sort of, well, we're going to have to here very shortly, next week or so.
Some of these former sheriffs in here that have been on the board. Listen, I guarantee you before he showed up here tonight, he dropped something off at my house for me to eat. He worries me to death. He wants cold, sweet tea every day. Thank you.